Um, Thank you. First of all, thank you to Vishal for inviting me to give the lecture today. It's a great honor to be here. I think it's been I think we were saying almost a decade since I've been through, and so I get to talk about what I've been up to since I last visited, which actually so the slides will come back, I assume. So I'll just talk through it, and you'll get the video intermittently. I started working on so I'm going to talk about some work that's really kind of spanned at least 15 years of my career. I actually thought that this was going to be a question that was a one and done, simple, easy, quick paper, move on, get back to internet security problems, et cetera. And this problem has really kind of taken over the better part of my career. The research that I'm going to talk about today is really all about measuring internet speeds and internet performance. And it started with a really simple question, which I'll pose to you right now, which was, how fast is my access internet speed, the thing that I'm buying from Comcast or Charter or what have you, and how does that speed match up to what they're advertising? What the ISP is advertising. This was a question that was being posed in the early 2000s. There was a lot of I would say unhappy consumers at the time, really saying like, "Hey, I'm really not getting what I'm paying for." And so it started with a question, just to kind of look into that. And actually, it didn't even start here in the United States. It started in France. This will come full circle at the end of the talk, because my co-founder, my company co-founder, is actually in France now as well. But the question really started came from Renata Teixeira, who was actually now here in New York working at Netflix. But at the time, she was a researcher in Paris. And she said, actually, I've got this interesting data set. It's basically like French DSL reports. It's called Grenouille. I think that's like a frog or something for the francophones. In any case, she said, I got this really interesting data set. It's like all these speed tests from people all across France, different ISPs, et cetera. Let's just basically, like, I don't know, at the time it was like Perl. Let's just like run some Perl scripts over the speed tests. We'll write a quick paper on like what internet speeds look like across France, and then be done with it. So the thing this site is long gone, but it sort of looked like this. It's like, okay, here's like somebody's reports for what this looks like on a particular ISP, and we basically had all this data. And we said, okay, cool, let's just like analyze it, write a quick paper, and be done with it. And the problem became immediately apparent. This is actually just a screenshot from an old talk, which is like, okay, we started plotting what these speeds look like for different ISPs. These are 4 different ISPs in France. We basically looked at like in 1.0 here. So this is a cumulative distribution function. So it's like an integral. For those of you who are not familiar with it, it's like an integral of the histogram. Okay, so this would be median right here. And 1.0 would be like, okay, this is like the speeds are matching up to the advertised service level from the ISP. And it was like, okay, well, there are all these like users in the data set who are getting basically less than 80%, certainly, a lot less than half. And I don't know if that was like a huge surprise to us at the time. It was kind of a surprise because this was early 2000s. But the real problem like we had with that was like that we had no idea why. Absolutely no. And so we couldn't attribute this to any cause. And as it started to become clear as we looked at the data set, like we realized that there were limitations with what we could do with this data and what conclusions we could draw, because there were all kinds of problems with the ways the data was collected. Things like negative round trip latencies and other things. And because we hadn't collected the data, we were really at our limit as to like what we could say about this type of problem. And so we very quickly concluded that we needed to build something to actually measure the speeds of the ISPs from the access networks themselves. And I'll come back around to that in a while. But that was really the simple question that got us started. And it was like, okay, on the surface, this is like a really intuitive, simple question. It's like, okay, how fast is my ISP? And then how do I measure it? It's like, well, that should be easy, right? We just like push bits down the pipe as fast as we can, and then we just divide that by some unit time, and then we're done, right? That's throughput. Right? That's like sort of just basic systems and networking. How hard could it be? Well, here I am like 15, almost 20 years later, still working on the problem. So it's pretty hard. So I'm going to come back to what we've done, but like let me just sort of talk a little bit more about the problems of like sourcing this data. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with like this tool. Anybody run this one? Speed test? Yeah, all right. Speaking of the right crowd. So what I do is in one of the things I do in like day one of my networking class is I actually just I just standing up here and say, hey, basically everybody, can you please run a speed test? Just like tell me what you got and like fill it into some, here's a Google form, just like fill it out. What do you get? And you basically get stuff like this. It's like all over the place, right? We could do this right now, and I'm sure you'd get a similar kind of distribution. It's like everything from like 80, 100 megabits per second, like sitting here in the room in the Wi-Fi, like down to like 5, just ridiculous numbers all over the place. You run it back to back, you get different numbers, et cetera. And the question that then I pose to my class, right, is like, well, why? Why is that, right? And those of you who work in this field, I'm sure can come up with many, many reasons. We actually wrote a paper on this. This is with a colleague at Comcast, Jason Livingood. We wrote this paper about 3-4 years ago. And it turns out that measuring the speed of the network and getting something that actually makes sense as far as those metrics is actually pretty hard. And the challenge has really kind of become harder as network technology has improved and kind of overtaken what was at once kind of a much simpler problem. When we first started this type of work back in the late 2000s, like 2008, 2010, access ISPs were a lot slower. And so you could basically do the thing that I mentioned, like let's just push bits down the pipe as fast as we can, and then just divide by time. And like you're pretty sure you're measuring the access network because it's the slowest thing out there, right? I mean, DSL was pretty slow, and then cable like was maybe a little bit faster at first, like not great. There wasn't a lot of Wi-Fi deployment, and so you basically people measuring things from their home wired networks, and you get a number, and you're pretty sure it's your access network. Well, fast forward from 2010 through the mid 2010s, and this starts to get a lot more complicated. Basically, all of these things that I've listed on the slide here, from the test design to your network environment to the path that you're measured, where is the path from the thing you measured to the server you're measuring against, to what infrastructure you're using to basically implement the test. Those all create wrinkles in your data. You basically have now a real, I guess in the modern lingo, this is a data science problem. All kinds of dirty data that you got to basically figure out what the underlying meaning of it is. And then, even if you basically figure out what a single number means in a single point in time, that's great. Back in the 2010s, that was all most people cared about, was what's my internet connection doing? And is that speed, is it what I'm paying for? Is it good enough for me, et cetera? But more recently, and as the title of the talk suggests, policymakers, advocates, non-governmental organizations, et cetera, have been much more interested in questions of things like equity and spatial characteristics of the data. So if we want to basically ask a question like, well, what do internet speeds or what does internet performance look like in, I don't know, Chelsea versus Harlem? I mean, that might be an interesting question to ask, but how do we bring data to a question like that? And so, how do we basically reason about geography? And then how do we reason about well, is it better than last year? Okay, so that question is ongoing, but I am going to talk about many of these other challenges for the rest of the hour. And this is essentially why this has kept me very busy. I think we certainly, I don't have time to talk about all of them today, but probably for each bullet on this slide where we've tried to address something, there's at least one or two papers that have come out in a few PhD theses. So that simple question has continued to keep us pretty busy. Let me just mention a few things. I'm going to unpack a few of these as I go, and where it's applicable, I'll talk about some of the research that went into some of the challenges that we addressed here. Let me first actually start with one that wasn't a research paper, but actually came up through. I'm starting here because it's a New York example, and I'm glad to see you here. MLab will feature heavily in certain parts of this talk, and this is an interesting story. So, I think it was it must have been late 2016 or so, 2017, where New York Attorney General sued Charter for advertising faster speeds than it was able to deliver. Now, the facts in this case, by the way, another interesting local story, the person who worked for the New York Attorney General, Mahir Kashur-Sagar, is now running the Tech Policy Clinic at Princeton. We actually met through being on opposing sides of this case. So the facts for Charter were not super helpful. They were doing things that basically involved, let's say, giving users Wi-Fi access points that had no reasonable hope of meeting the speeds that they'd advertised. And so I'm going to come to Wi-Fi bottlenecks shortly, but there were things that certainly weren't very helpful for Charter. But one of the things that got me kind of riled in the case was actually the use of this. They were using basically client-driven speed tests to support some of the claims. And so one of the things that I dug into, I was actually expert for Charter in this case, and one of the things that we looked at was the data that they were using was client-driven speed tests, and New York City, yeah, this was New York, yeah, but they were using actually in this case the MLab data. So one of the things that we did in that was to split out, and so this was a while ago. This was late 2010s. So we split out speed tier versus iPhone model. So this is 50 megabits per second up to 300, and then you've got 5 and 5S iPhones and 6 as well. And one of the things that you kind of see that's interesting here, right, is that some of these. So this is box and whisker plot, right? So this is the distribution, right? So this is 90th percentile, if I'm not mistaken. And you see basically some of these, and then outliers. Some of these are never going above 100, right? Even for, here's your advertised speeds here, 200, 300, et cetera. But one of the things you'll notice immediately from these is that some of these that are just capped out at 100 are iPhone 5 and 5Ss, right? And so what was actually happening in this particular data set was that the speeds that were sort of being reflected in the speed tests as oh, this is what Charter was delivering. Well, no, I mean, it was what they were delivering. They were delivering it to those iPhones, but in fact, this case, the bottleneck was the iPhone. So that's just one example of the challenges of speed test. I'm going to roll back in time. Another one. This is I'm going to talk about. This is Guilherme Martins, who worked with me almost from the very beginning on some of this. And this is from one of the first papers that we wrote on the topic. Actually, I can go back to. Oh, I want this map. So there was an article. I don't know, maybe 6 to 8 years ago, maybe a little longer. Staggering discrepancy in Pennsylvania between rural and urban broadband coverage study finds. And I covered up the most eyebrow-raising part of this, but actually it was my colleague at Comcast, Jason Livingood, who pointed this out to me, who said, this is actually, you should basically take a look at this because it shows, yeah, sure, we know maybe that there's issues with, rural broadband connectivity, but this data shows that Center City, Philadelphia, doesn't have broadband access, which is probably not correct. So what was going on, basically in this period of time, again, maybe 8-ish years ago, was that certain tests that were being used there's different ways that you actually back up. There's different ways you can try to fill a pipe, right? Remember I mentioned like, well, speed conceptually kind of simple. You just push as many bits down the pipe as you can in a unit time, and then you basically figure out how much time that took, and then you divide, right? Well, but hang on, how many connections are you going to open to do that, right? Okay, so if you do that with a single connection, then the properties of that connection, how much packet loss, latency, et cetera, they start to play a role. This is precisely why your browser, other applications will try to open up many connections in parallel to try to improve the performance, the speed of your download, et cetera. And so certain tests that were being used at the time were using like basically one thread or one connection. And that will get you like to a certain, again, this is a CDF, that will get you to maybe like 70% of like what you might see. And then other tests like Ookla, speed tests, et cetera, they basically got you a little bit more. So I could spend a whole hour talking about like this particular issue. I think it's actually kind of water under the bridge now. But again, it's an interesting tale because back in the day when speeds were slower, these kinds of design decisions mattered less. As speeds increase, then suddenly your test design, your device capabilities start to become bottlenecks in ways that you're actually measuring other things besides what you think you're measuring. By the way, this is, yeah, like I said, this is not a policy talk, but there's an interesting intersection here between like technically what are you trying to measure, and then policy-wise, what are people trying to advocate? How do those things translate to regulation, et cetera? How does that translate to what an ISP is claiming it's selling a consumer, et cetera? We were inspired by some of the actually it was this work was like 2010, okay, and it maybe took us like I think it was about 10, 11 years before we actually managed to write this paper, but this was something that I wanted to do for a long time. And the reason that it took us a while to do this was because we had to build the system and actually do a deployment that would enable it. So the idea here is that like, well, there's many different ways to run a speed test. As I mentioned, there's different ways to design it. You're going to get different numbers. Everybody kind of knew that from like, you know, just textbook, right? It's like, well, obviously you're going to have more connections. You're going to basically maybe do a little bit better in certain circumstances. People tried this in the lab, sure. But what I really wanted to do was like see how that played out in practice on real deployed broadband access networks. And so after many, many years, we were able to build this platform that allowed us to basically deploy these speed tests in hundreds of homes across the country and then basically run them in parallel, not in parallel, sequentially, right? Basically one shortly after the other, et cetera. Obviously, a bunch of test design details that one has to think about there. So we were able to do that finally, and I think a lot of interesting takeaways from the paper. I would refer you to that. But I think one of the major takeaways that I wanted to point out was like actually not super intellectually interesting, but actually practically very important, which was that we kind of knew from what I had said before that there was, you know, that there were real effects between like a single connection or a multi-connection. So in theory, like we didn't even need to write this paper, right? Because it was like, okay, that's kind of evident. But merely by basically building it and doing it, it actually enabled us to uncover some other things. So like in this particular case, this was like, yeah, in 2021, we noticed basically that one of the speed tests was like consistently reporting. So here's basically the green and the blue is what you want to look at. And this is just one home, but it's like consistently reporting like under, you know, way under reporting. And it turns out like, I mean, and again, I think credit to, I mean, this is sort of speaks to the importance of open source testing, et cetera. The designers of the test in blue, this is the NDT test, because it was all open source, we were able to just post this as an issue, right? And they said, okay, oh, actually, there's actually a problem here. It turned out to be a memory allocation problem that related in, it basically resulted in slowdowns in the way that buffer memory was being allocated from a buffer. It was fixed. In any case, I think it's like actually super important lesson there for, I mean, I think we always like to talk about in computer systems, you don't really know until you like build it or try it. Here was a case where like, yeah, I didn't really expect that we would learn much from this paper, but it would be like nice to have the side-to-side comparison. You never quite know until you actually do it. Another problem with sort of another challenge one encounters with the data from client-based tests is network environment. Specific, there's a lot of things that go into network environment, but a big one these days is Wi-Fi. And actually, this paper just appeared in the Internet Measurement Conference just last month. And this was actually this was like a decade in the making. It's actually take two of this paper. We have an earlier version of it from like 10 years ago that I've now cut from the talk because the speeds are very quaint. But it's like same story, right? The story often is like, well, yeah, you could basically upgrade your ISP service tier, but like, what about the Wi-Fi? Like, to what extent is your Wi-Fi the bottleneck? Turns out in that charter case, Wi-Fi was a big bottleneck as well. But so the system that we had built that basically that I've discussed a little bit that allowed us to basically, that we deployed in homes, we started off basically with the idea that, okay, we're going to deploy that like, we first deployed it as the home router, okay? And then that became untenable, like as speeds got faster. And then like, okay, we're going to deploy it as a Raspberry Pi, like attached to the router. Okay, so we did that. And then we're like, hey, wait a second. We actually have a Raspberry Pi sitting in the home, like attached to the router. So now, like for years, we'd been basically sending speed tests like out on the wired network, eliminating the Wi-Fi as the source of variability. But we're like, hey, wait, maybe we should also study the Wi-Fi. So what we did then was basically build a browser plugin, right? That was essentially speed test built into a browser plugin. We enticed people to install it by giving them this nice dashboard, right? It said like, okay, here's basically our measurement of speed. By the way, this is from my home. And this is a fairly illustrative example, but here's basically what you're getting from your modem, right? Like this is what we're measuring from the Raspberry Pi, like plugged in. It's not technically the modem, but as close as we can get to it. And I think I basically signed up for a gig, so that's like looking pretty good. Highly asymmetric, which is maybe the topic for another day, but that looks okay. And then like, here's my Wi-Fi. Okay, I picked a particularly bad moment, but 30 megabits per second off the Wi-Fi. And you can see like here, that story basically plays out. This is like prevalence in terms of like what fraction of our measurements, which basically we've spaced them out. You can kind of think about that as time. How often or how prevalent are Wi-Fi bottlenecks in these homes that we were measuring, depending on like the speed tier, the wired speed that the users had really signed up for. And this is kind of what you would expect, right? It's like, well, the higher speed you basically sign up for from your ISP or you're getting, right? The more, then it's like almost 100% of the time you're seeing like Wi-Fi is the bottleneck, it's the limiting factor. That's not super surprising. I think basically the reason I like to talk about this particular work is this is, again, something that like everybody kind of knows or sort of suspected, right? But then how do you basically bring that to bear? How do you bring the data to bear to basically allow people to diagnose it, talk about it, work on it? This turns out to be important for, again, for policy-related reasons. If we're going to talk about like, in fact, the very next slide I'm going to talk about is like, why are we doing this in the first place? It's nice to basically get these like numbers, but we're really doing this because we want to improve people's experience. Right? And if the problem is the Wi-Fi, then we basically need data to also support that. That becomes an important question for regulators, for policymakers, for advocates, et cetera, because we're going to invest money in infrastructure, like, well, where are the problems in the infrastructure? As it turns out as well, becomes an interesting problem commercially as well, because as I'll get to it later, if you're experiencing poor performance to like, I don't know, iCloud or FaceTime or whatever, and you're like, this is terrible, right? Apple's horrible. Well, it might actually be your Wi-Fi. And so companies like that actually do care about being able to pinpoint the problem as well. So kind of changing, not quite changing gears, but broadening the lens a little bit. So I've been talking mostly about just like numbers to this point, just raw speeds. But really, I don't know, I guess as networking nerds, we like numbers, but I guess, as I got on with this, I sort of started to like think more and more about like, well, why should I keep working on this? And ultimately, what we want to be doing as like technologists and researchers, et cetera, is like making people's lives better, right? And in this case, it's like, well, I don't know, it's nice to have a number of like a gig or 900 or whatever, but really what I care about is like, I don't know, my web page is loading, right? Or can I use Zoom, or how's Netflix going? And so I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit more about how the work that we've done has like sort of really slowly evolved from just like raw speed network metrics to more like user quality of experience types of metrics. And actually, that question, it has roots going back almost the entire time I was working on this. Actually, this is actually an IMC paper from like 2014, greatest hits. And this is actually due to, let me just drop the punchline for just a minute, but this is due, I was looking for a picture of the guy and I couldn't find one. But this was actually this question is a theme here. A lot of the stuff that I've chosen to work on has been posed to me as questions from other smart people who just don't know the answers. And this one came from Walter Johnston, who was running the Measuring Broadband America program at the FCC. I don't see Henning here today, but Henning would be certainly well familiar with OET and what's that? Of course he is. But so he would be well familiar with this office, and those of you who've talked with Henning about his work too would certainly understand like where this is coming from. But the Measuring Broadband America program, I think actually just ended, but it had been going on for almost 15 years, and it was basically like it's a government version of what I've been describing so far. Let's just sign up people as a panel, right, to measure speeds from their homes, and they basically were doing router-based testing. And at the time, like they'd been running the program 2-3 years at that point, and Walter Johnson said, I think basically we should do some things like web testing, because I suspect that as speeds get faster, the web, the user's web performance is going to basically just plateau at some point. Like faster speeds don't actually matter. And lo and behold, that's the case. And so this was a very interesting project that we worked with, and actually credit to Srikant Sundarasan, who was like the first PhD student of mine to work on this project. It was in his PhD thesis, but he designed this web test that eventually went into the Measuring Broadband America program as part of the Sam Knows FCC suite. But sure enough, I should just back up. Y-axis here is like how fast is your web page loading, and this is the log scale, right? So down is better, right? Right, lower page loads. And your x-axis here is like speed, ISP, throughput, as measured by us, right? Now that we know how to measure speeds, like we started to like plot things against it. And sure enough, like it basically does plateau. Okay, so I thought I was done with that problem. Yes, it's gonna get better, so hang on. Yeah. I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, I think it's, I mean, I don't know because I haven't done it, but I could speculate or suspect that you'd get a similar shaped plot because what's going on here is the limiting factors are latency, certainly not throughput and probably not goodput either. But it's a good question. It's worth trying, but I suspect it would look pretty similar. Okay, I thought I was done with this. I mean, I thought we were done with this question. And then must have been like 2 or 3 years after we wrote this paper, some folks from the Wall Street Journal came to us and they said, hey, we've been getting, actually that was here in New York City as well. They said, hey, we've been getting a lot of calls from like just like readers and stuff saying that they're getting upsold by their ISP, where it was like, okay, my Netflix is slow. And then they'd call Comcast or Charter or whatever, and they'd be like, no problem, just like we'll just subscribe you to the next highest tier. well, this is web, not video, right? But you could probably see where this is going, right? Because it's like everybody's kind of suspecting, like, does the faster speed, like, does the faster throughput, like, improve your Netflix performance? And again, that was sort of a question where we kind of done this. This was web, but we're like, yeah, probably not. I mean, we know like that the throughput of Netflix stream is not hundreds of megabits per second, right? And so there's probably some point at which it sort of like plateaus. And then the question was like, well, at what number, like at what throughput number does it start plateauing? So this is another question where it was like, yeah, intuitively we kind of know like that this, that there's some limit, there's some knee on that curve, but where is it? So let's try to find it. So we thought that was going to be like pretty easy because we'd done this, and this was like 2016, roughly. So we're like, okay, no problem. We know how to do like web page load speeds. We know how to do the x-axis throughput. This should be pretty cake, right? Like we just measured the speeds of the access link, and then we put on the y-axis, we put like I don't know, startup delay or frame rate or video bit rate or whatever. And it's like all in the video streaming protocol dash, right? It's like all there, just for the taking. The only problem is if we remember our internet history from like the mid 2010s, this other thing was going on at the time, which was the increasing encryption of the web, right? So now it was like if we had done this in 2013, like the Netflix streams would have been in plain sight. Now we're like talking 2016, 2017, and everything's encrypted. So without access to the client, with only access to the network, we were basically presented with this question of like, well, we know how to do the x-axis, and now if we want to put something on the y-axis that relates to the quality of the video, we've got an inference problem on our hands. So here comes machine learning. So that's basically what we started. That's what we spent we spent like 3-4 years working on that problem, which was like, okay, we've got encrypted traffic streams, right? And then we basically want to infer various things from the quality of those videos. So traffic's encrypted. We'd like to do this in real time. We're still working on the real time aspects. I'll come to that at the end of this segment of the talk. What kinds of things are we interested in? We're interested in like startup delay. How fast does it take for the video to start playing? What's the resolution of the video? Does it rebuffer, right? And then another one that's sort of a binary detection problem is like, did the video change the resolution? So these are related, obviously, but slightly different prediction problems. This one being important, right? Because if you've ever watched a video and it's like changing quality, that's like almost more annoying than watching a low resolution video in the first place, right? Okay, so let me just kind of walk you through what we had to do for that. The first thing we had to do, so for this study, we worked with the Wall Street Journal investigative reporting team. We deployed our speed testing, et cetera, technology in about 60 to 80 homes, mostly reporters, actually, mostly right here in New York City. We did our speed testing stuff that we knew how to do. We also, and this is where it got, interesting, I would say. We also basically took packet captures from the homes because we needed to know, like, basically what quality, we needed to have some traffic to work with so we could do the quality inference. So, of course, interesting privacy questions arise there, et cetera. Short on time today, but needless to say, a lot of interesting questions between like your choices about do you do an active test, right? And there's all kinds of issues with the active test, or you do a passive, like a traffic sniffing thing, and then you got to deal with privacy, et cetera. So in any case, in this study, we did the active throughput testing, we did the passive application quality inference. First step, is like we could potentially see everything, right? And the first thing we needed to do was figure out like, oh, okay, that's Netflix traffic in the stream. So this problem, for this one, we used fairly simple techniques. I mean, we were using the domain name system. I don't know the level of sophistication of the audience here, but like, raise your hand if I lose you. But basically what we did in this case was figure out like, okay, if this client over here does a domain name lookup to particular content delivery networks that are serving those streams, right? Then I can basically map those back to IP addresses, and I can figure out which flows to capture. So that's actually, I think, I mean, there's some really probably interesting follow-on inference problems one could work on there, particularly as now when we were doing this, DNS wasn't encrypted, but now it is. So some more interesting problems one could work on there. But we ended up basically using the DNS for that. I'm going to skip a few steps just because of limited time. But once you figure out this is Netflix traffic, you got a few more steps because is it someone loading the web page? Is it like browsing the catalog? Is it autoplay coming out of the catalog? Or are they actually like watching a video, which is like the thing we truly care about? So there was like a few more steps that one had to take in the inference, which is like, okay, this is actually streaming the video. And here's basically, we've now identified the session. Turns out you can do this. Actually, there was a paper I mentioned that was a year prior to this. But the next one we basically worked on was actually you can do this, and turns out there's a bunch of features. If you think like hard enough, and even actually not that hard, because there's a lot of people who've done similar things. A lot of features available to you in an encrypted packet stream, even without looking at the content of the traffic. And there's your good put if you're asking about that. But a lot of things you basically could just throw at the model. I haven't told you about the model training yet. Come to that. But let's assume for a second you have a trained model, right? Okay, so there's a lot of features you can extract from the packet trace that actually work pretty well. One of the things, and I'll mention this as I wrap this part of the talk as well, but one of the things that we got the idea to work on, and still keeping me busy now, like we're still writing papers on model serving, but you probably don't need all these features. Like on take one, we basically threw them all at the model, and it worked. But some of these are more expensive to compute than others. So the next question that we've begun to ask is like, well, let's suppose you want to do this really fast, right? And maybe you don't care, as much about accuracy, or maybe you do, but are there subsets of features you can use to get a really fast time to decision? So there's reasons you might want to do that. So we're working on that. I said for a second, like, let's assume you have the model. Here are the features. But a big challenge we faced in this problem, and I'm going to roll this forward in just a minute to things I'm working on today. But a big challenge is like, well, in order to train a model, you need labeled data. Right? So if my features are all the things I showed you on the previous slide and my target predictions are like startup delay and resolution, I need examples of packet traces that have those resolutions, those startup delays, et cetera, et cetera. So what do we do about that? And by the way, they need to be labeled. Geez, okay. Well, what we were able to do, and again, we didn't know that this was actually going to work when we tried it. It was just, this is the best we had. We basically did it in the lab. So there's similar analogies for all these services, but I'll just describe it in terms of Netflix. If you're, I don't know, into this kind of stuff, you might know that there's like hotkeys you can press on your Netflix stream, like when it's streaming in the browser, and you can get all the metadata, like frame rates and resolution, frame by frame. And it basically just overlays it right on the video. Used to be like Command Option T or something. It's just a magic keystroke. So we're like, great, let's just like auto browse sessions. Let's just browse like hundreds of sessions, and then we'll do traffic shaping like in our lab, and then we'll basically just induce various types of settings, and then we'll collect all the features, and we'll scrape the target prediction, and then we'll train the model. Turns out basically that works pretty well. And one of the things that we weren't, and I shouldn't say like we validated this part, but I think it seemed to work well enough. We didn't know this was going to work, like, because people are streaming from like phones, iPads, set-top boxes, et cetera. We can only do this from the browser. Okay, so our training set was fairly limited in terms of its device environment. And then I'll talk a little bit more about like what I'm thinking about for the future on that in just a couple slides. But that was something that I think, happy accident, seemed to work fairly well. One of the things that we had to do to get this to work was something called domain augmentation, right, or data augmentation, where you don't want basically the model to overfit on some of those things that I showed on the big orange table, right? It's like, okay, packet inter arrival time. You don't want it zeroing in on like 17 milliseconds or whatever, right? So what we had to do in any case was take this labeled set, augment it with basically, noisy versions of the initial training set, and I'll call it fine tuning. It wasn't called that, I think, at the time, but we basically augmented our training set with additional synthetic noise augmented data to actually get that to work. Eventually, I'll skip the results because I want to talk about some other things, but they're kind of, again, as you might expect, it was like, okay, above about 50 megabits per second, things are not basically improving for startup delay resolution, et cetera. The Wall Street Journal decided to spin this one in a particular way. You can see got people really angry, including many of our collaborators. So I think this was actually an opportunity for me to speak a little bit about that. But they basically ran a front page story on this back in 2017. Now, I mentioned early on in the talk, some of my collaborators are at Comcast, and boy, they were really pissed to see this story. I think this is an interesting point in the talk where I can maybe step back and talk about what's importance to sort of research integrity, et cetera, right? Because I think this particular study, I'm not a reporter, I don't write spin like this, but and credit to, I think, the engineers at ISPs who are bright-eyed enough to sort of see this, which is some of the lawyers' policies, they were really mad. They're like, hey, we fund this guy. What's this about? And credit to Jason, he was like, no, we actually want researchers doing work like this because, whether or not it plays out in our favor, right, is not what. That's not what it's about. Basically, sometimes when those facts are in our favor, we want those independent experts to be able to talk about that. And so I think this is an example of something where our study was really value neutral. It was spun a particular way, created some interesting side discussions for me, but I ultimately was very, very proud of how that came out. Yes? Is that why Harry started being Wall Street Journal reporters? Maybe, yeah, maybe. I mean, I think definitely there are a lot of great questions to come out of. As I mentioned, a lot of the questions that I'm posing here, none of them really came from my head. This one came from reporters. So, okay, looking at the time and making sure that I have time to basically talk about everything. I'm going to basically just quickly mention some directions that were headed. So I'm just 15, 30 seconds on each of these. Where have we gone from here? Another area that we've started to push is to say okay, we did web, we did video on demand, let's look at basically real-time video. So recently, and this is a current PhD student, Tavish Sharma, who's also been working on things that I'm going to talk at the end of the talk, who's built some models on that. The other thing, and this is a topic that I'm going to take up in sort of the informal session later this afternoon, is I mentioned the challenge we had in acquiring training data. And so a couple of years ago when Stable Diffusion came out, some students were like, hey, this thing's neat. You guys did this other piece of work we did was deep learning on bitmaps of packet traces. You already did the image to packet trace thing. Stable Diffusion makes images. Why don't we make some network traffic? And I was like, okay, sounds trendy or whatever. What's the use of that? And I was like, oh, wait a minute. Actually, there is a use because it's actually really hard to get ample packet traces, especially labeled traces. And so one of the things that we continue to work on now is synthetic trace generation. Another area that I continue to work on, as I mentioned, with that big orange table is you don't have to necessarily throw all the features at the model. You can pick the ones that are easier to collect or train or result in a smaller model, et cetera. And that's another area that we continue to work on. Okay, for the last 10-ish minutes, I'd like to kind of bring it back and sort of talk about another aspect of this larger goal, which is well, what are we doing here? We're trying to basically make lives better for people. And when I moved to Chicago 5 years ago, It took me this picture of like Comcast trucks in front of my house. There were actually like 4 of them. They didn't fit all in the frame. Here's the guy, like I learned how they string cable like through trees and stuff. Like they don't actually climb trees. They use these big ass like poles. In any case, it was a major hassle to get Comcast to my house in Hyde Park, like basically a stone's throw from the university, like not exactly under-resourced neighborhood. And it was gonna take longer, except like I've got friends at Comcast, as I told you. And so, but then I looked at like the FCC data and it was like, oh, look, they say they offer this to my area. And like, there's this beautiful map. It's like, looks awesome. And I was like, what the heck? Like, this is terrible. And I was like, if this is what it looks like for me, I'm sure it's like bad all over the place. So like, maybe we should start to look at this. And this was 2019. This was like 6 to 8 months before the pandemic. And so timing was like lucky. But then the pandemic hit. And people were like, oh my gosh, this is like a real issue. We've got people like learning from home and like doing, trying to basically exist. And there's all kinds of issues. Same story here in New York City, I'm sure. So what are we gonna do about it? And then it was like, okay, what happened like at the beginning of the pandemic was like, oh my gosh, everybody's moving home. Like the internet's gonna melt down. This is horrible. Like this is like, is it actually even gonna work? And we actually studied that a little bit as well. The long story short there is that it basically worked. I mean, we all experienced this, right? It basically worked. It didn't work by magic, by the way. A lot of internet service providers increased their provisioning on links between them and Zoom and other things to actually like make it work. It was not magic. And I think Henning and Dave Clark and others had a very nice piece in the journal on exactly this as well. But the thing that actually we did notice is that like, hey, if you had internet, it was like pretty okay. But if you didn't have internet, you basically couldn't participate in life. And so now we've got a problem. And so that inspired me to basically think more about spatial issues and issues of equity. And I started this larger project called the Internet Equity Initiative. It started kind of, again, questions didn't come from me. Questions came from people like City of Chicago. Here's one that, and I basically said, please write down like all the things you want to know. And here was one. What is the baseline internet performance level and speed that should be considered acceptable for remote learning? It's like, oh, that sounds familiar. I mean, we did the web testing, we did the video demand thing. So like, let's just study that one. And so that one we also did a study looking at like, okay, for the video conferencing applications, what are the speeds they require? What kind of network conditions result in better or worse performance? How does that vary if you're on a one-on-one video conference versus a lecture, et cetera? And so again, question that was really motivated by, again, people, not us, in this case, City of Chicago. Okay, moving on. People started to want to ask questions about space, right? Neighborhoods. And let me ask you what you think these plots show. This is speed test data. This is Ookla speed test. Anybody know what this, anybody want to take a guess as to like what this plot shows? I should have put New York City on here, probably have it somewhere. Yeah, slower. So yeah, and I bet like if you plotted speeds, like it would be the shading would be quite similar. This is like wealthier areas of Chicago on the north side. Here's like the U Chicago pocket down here. But you can see basically, okay, so if you were to plot speed, it'd probably look like this. But in fact, what this is the number of Ookla speed test samples in the neighborhoods. Okay, so it's real interesting, right? Because it was like, oh, great, I'm going to basically work on this problem. I'm going to solve it. We're going to bring data to bear. Amazing. Well, the very places that have infrastructure problems because the internet is slow and bad, they're also the places that actually have like less data about like the fact that the internet is bad. And so if you want to basically make decisions about how to, the Biden administration, I think it's invested like $60 billion doled out to states. I think the state of Illinois alone got like more than $1 billion to basically spread out among the state to like improve internet connectivity in places where it's bad. Well, if you don't have data about like where it's bad, like how are you going to make those decisions? And so that brings me to this question that we continue to study right now, but it's basically how do you basically reason about spatial geographies in internet measurements? And the bunch of issues here, right? So people, and by people I mean policymakers, government officials, probably even ISPs, they like to think about regions and cities that humans have drawn. So these are like these are neighborhoods in Chicago, right? But there's also you could think about like census tracts or what have you, and you could ask like, what does the performance here look like versus over there? Okay, fine. That's maybe the granularity at which like people who are governing or allocating think, but the internet was not like built around these boundaries, right? I mean, people are laying fiber and like putting up head ends and other things in a completely different manner. They're not talking about it in terms of census tracts, and so that was one question. And then the other is like, well, once you basically have a region that you want to talk about, how do you summarize that? Like how do you basically aggregate the data within a region? And then last one is like, well, how does it vary over time? And that one I still don't have, we're still working on that one. We're still working on all of these really, but the temporal one is one that we really haven't touched yet. Okay, so this paper appears in Sigmetrics like in next year, in fact. So effectively what the paper is about is taking crowdsourced speed test measurements like NDT or Ookla or what have you, and how do you basically reason about that data across geographies? Yes? Oh, in this study, it's quantitative. And so, oops, I know I want to respect the time. I will just put a pointer. I didn't participate in this work, but my collaborator, Nicole Marwell, did some really interesting studies about how the speeds related to performance in Chicago public schools. Sorry, I know we're short on time, but this is a really interesting punchline. For the middle to overachievers, the access to internet was a positive. For the middle to underachievers, the access to internet actually decreased the performance of the students, which I don't think they know quite why, but I think we could speculate as to why. It's like, well, the internet, right? I mean, there's a lot of maybe good uses for it, but there's also a lot of stuff out there, right? So there have been some qualitative studies associated with this, but everything I'm talking about here is basically quantitative. So in this case, basically, first step was to take those crowdsourced measurements, which are spaced out, and sort of interpolate them at a regular grid spacing so that we could do a hexagon overlay. So that was done with inverse distance weighting. So we did that. Then we looked at, and by the way, this was motivated by, I think, a lot of these techniques have come out of physics or astronomy. We later learned that as the FCC is doing this on cellular network data, they're also using hexagons. Interesting reason to use a hexagon, right? Because actually, squares don't really make sense because of the way gradients work across performance, but also circles would be awesome, but circles create like gaps. So hexagons turn out to be pretty nice. Got to figure out basically the resolutions and how you tessellate. So we did that. We aggregated in different ways, and then we basically looked at different ways to cluster. Again, we didn't invent this technique. We used a bunch of different techniques. We looked at a bunch of different techniques. We ended up, going with a technique called Skater, which again I think that came out of spatial data analysis. I think maybe in astronomy even. In any case, this is again, as I mentioned, this is the first paper on this. It's appearing in the next Sigmetrics. But this is still very much work in progress. I mean, it probably comes as no surprise that like administrative and data-driven boundaries don't necessarily align. We did actually look at the robustness of these clusters. They're fairly robust to the different parameters. We also see that even as you draw clusters like this, you still see significant variation within neighborhood levels. And so that's our next step. The project we're working on now, the next paper is working with some spatial data scientists and social scientists using multi-level modeling to understand within a region, what are the explanations for why performance varies within that region? Okay, is it the ISP? Is it the devices, the Wi-Fi, et cetera? Because that very question that I started on slide 2, we still don't have great ways to explain the sources of variation, but that's now what we're working on. I'll mention just a few things. I mean, this particular project I'm quite proud of. Not only has there been a lot of research, but been able to engage with policymakers, as I mentioned. I've also been working with a lot of high school students. Like this is Chris Dang, who's now first generation U Chicago undergrad, but I started working with him on as an AP computer science research project, and he used our data to look at how internet access varied across the Chicago public school system, et cetera. And Rania, also I mentioned earlier, the Wi-Fi bottleneck study. She started working on this as like a sophomore in high school and is now a third year at U Chicago, double majoring in computer science and public policy. A lot of software, a lot of data sets, et cetera. We are short on time and I'm almost done. Oops, that skipped further ahead than I wanted. Another thing that we've begun to work on, and I think this is really like also something that I'm starting to learn a lot more, and is like industry, the work we're doing with industry is coming full circle, is with the person I worked on with the inference of QoE from encrypted traffic. Someone said, hey, that's really interesting. You maybe should start a company or whatever. So like, okay, here we are on that rat hole. One of the problems we've been working on there, and I think one of the things that like we've been working on with both Apple and Comcast is understanding latency spikes, right? So latency goes high. Now it's all about latency, right? It used to be all about throughput. Now it's all about latency. It's like latency goes high, but nobody has any idea why. Is it like a routing change? Is it because like everybody's going through a VPN? Is it like the customer's Wi-Fi? Is it the user's Wi-Fi? Is it a device? So you see the data, there's tons of data, but nobody still like knows how to make sense of it in a way that's like, okay, is it our brand that we have to worry about? And if it's our brand, like, you know, how do we basically pinpoint the problem? So to be continued on that. I suspect LLMs are going to be an answer, but yes, Sal. We should. And so like one of the directions I'm going, and actually the NSF grant I'm writing next, and where we're going with this technology is like models for multimodal data. So we actually wrote a paper 3 or 4 years ago that was on a completely different topic, like activity recognition using video and network data. I was like, oh, we've already done multimodal modeling. Now I think maybe let's try to apply it to network data. So no, weather data, I think is a good idea, especially since there's been research papers on exactly that. Okay, I'm done. I'm almost done. I got like two, 3 more slides, but like, I think I found this really to be a quite fulfilling journey. I mean, this started like with a simple question. In terms of my own research space, I love simple questions that I could just explain to someone on the street in like a sentence that actually have like many, many layers of the onion. I didn't know that was going to be the case in this project, but it has turned out to be. And I would say also that when I got really interested in that, like, you know, the Comcast poll thing and the equity, like everyone I talked to was like, yeah, that seems like important socially, but like, is there like a hard technical problem there? And I was like, I don't know. Let's just like look. And one thing I found like over and over in this work is that like the question might seem simple, but like if it's unanswered, there's probably something really hard just like lurking, you know, if not 1 layer below, maybe 2. And so like that has become a real theme. Over the time period that I've worked on this, like so many things have changed. Like, you know, access networks have gotten way faster. ML was kind of like a little bit of a toy back in 2010, and now it's super real. And I mean, toy as far as like just practical applications, we were using it then too. But now it's like the first thing you turn to. It's become way more practical to just throw tons and tons of data at something and just hope for the best. And both collecting it, training the models, and deploying them will become practical. And also, people care. I think the pandemic like changed. It basically like flipped the script on all this, where it was like for years, like we've all been working on like, no, this is really important. Like you should care. And then 2020, it was like, oh my gosh, like I need internet. Okay, and so like that has changed in a way that's really kind of made this problem even more relevant, perhaps. And I think like over the years, as I've worked on this, like I've learned a few things, which is like, I mean, this is really for the students in the audience. I think there's a lot of problems out there that are like fun to work on, intellectually interesting puzzles, et cetera. But like, at least from my own experience, like I always found it like very fulfilling to start with a problem, an unsolved problem that someone really cares about. Like, I also happen to hope to care about it as well. But like underneath there's often really like countless intellectually interesting puzzles. So start with something that like is already a problem. And like real people have tons of problems, and if you just ask them, you'll learn a lot about maybe something to work on. And don't say like, oh, that sounds too simple, right? That's way too simple. That seems too easy. I don't know. Over and over again, I've been proven wrong. Like, okay, that seems really easy, so let's just solve it. Oh no, actually, this is really hard, right? Something that would take 2 weeks takes a year, right? Or 3 years, right? Or 15, right? Okay. I gave a few examples in the talk, right? Like the speed test comparison. Like a lot of things, basically, you just have to deploy, right? You're just not going to learn about the actual problems that are underneath until you actually deploy it. And then I think this is worth mentioning, right? I think, I don't know, as I get on, like, like had the good fortune to write a lot of papers, like that's been great. But like at some point I had to basically stop worrying about papers, okay? And it's tempting these days, especially like with conferences where there's like 10,000 papers or whatever, where it's like, oh, if I don't have 15 papers by my 3rd year of my PhD, I'm never gonna get a job. I would just, it's easy for me to say, but I would say, don't worry about that so much. Like, why are you doing this? Like, why did you get excited about it? I mean, like when you applied to grad school or like, probably didn't even know what a paper was, right? Or maybe like, and now it's like the most important thing, I got to get 5. It's like, no, step back and remember like why you came here in the first place, right? And I've continually had to remind myself of this too, is you get papers rejected, et cetera. It's like, why am I doing this? It's not to write sigmetrics or sigcom papers. It's actually basically to work on interesting problems and hopefully make the world a better place. And finally, I'll just say like the most important thing for me and like the most rewarding thing as I reflect on this is like just the like really cool people that I've had and really, really nice people that I've had the opportunity to work with over the course of this. Again, doesn't really matter what problems you work on. I find like just find people you want to work with. Like that's the interesting problems will come. Last slide. I stole this from, I should have put a picture of Nick McEwen on here. I actually stole this from his SIGCOMM Lifetime Achievement talk in 2012. It really kind of hit me, it like definitely sunk in with me. And I adapted it actually. He said in his talk, he said, when he was talking about software-defined networks at the time, he said, there doesn't need to be a conflict between an intellectually interesting idea and improving the practice. And like that really influenced me like throughout my career. It was like, no, we're like always talking about, yeah, like that has impact, but is it like interesting? Like, no, you can have both, right? And then this third one I added, right? As I started to think about equity, you can do all of these things. And so maybe start with the last two and then maybe figure out what the intellectually interesting ideas are in there. Because I guarantee they're there if the problem's not solved. Do whatever it takes. All right, thank you so much. Thanks, I went a little bit over.
Networks, like it seems like a lot of the work is more on Wi-Fi, browsers.
Yeah, we actually wrote a few papers on that, and there are also other people who continue to work on that. Ellen Zagura, Elizabeth Belding at UC Santa Barbara, Georgia Tech, have actually continued to work on cellular and mobile monitoring. And I think some of their work is actually being used by the FCC as like one of the standards for doing that. There are significant overlaps there in terms of like spatial sampling methodologies, et cetera. Like some of our work in the spatial sampling draws on some of the work that they've done. We've done a bit of work on that as well. Like for maybe mid-2010s, like we built an Android app to do some of that. And it's a different area, but it's highly related. A lot of the methods do carry over. And I think other things to say about that, it's becoming increasingly relevant, right, with fixed 5G, right? And I mean, I don't know how much like the LEO Starlink stuff also plays in there, but certainly fixed 5G, as it overlaps with policy as well. I mean, especially in the incoming administration, we're going to see, Musk and others saying like, no, satellite, wireless, et cetera. This is good enough for, for us to consider this rural region of the country covered. I mean, maybe for throughput right now, latency is iffy, right? And so there needs to be more in that area, but there are other researchers actively working in that as well. That's a good question. I mean, it turned to Hari. Hari actually my advisor actually started work in that area, like, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago. I don't know if that's still continuing or not, but I mean, he was a leader in that area. Haven't seen much in that recent. Are you familiar with any more work in that? There could be more. Yeah.
What is the temporal aspect of measurement here? Like every day the internet performance. 2009 somewhere. So how many days do you have to measure before time becomes good?
Yeah.
The second related question, what is the information or identification that based on the measurement?
Yeah, the second one I probably don't have a very concise answer for. So let me start with the first one. So the temporal variation is like actually that was a big reason, that was a big motivator for us to go deploy, because if you look at the crowdsourced measurements, in addition to all the stuff I mentioned, I was like, well, when do you run speed tests? You probably run it like when you first sign up for your internet connection and when your internet sucks, right? These are like the two times you run it. And so we're like, well, this is going to be a weird sample. Shouldn't we get like samples out at sort of regular intervals? And so like, we don't know. And actually, I still don't know what the appropriate sampling interval is on that, but it's a statistics problem, right? It's like, well, the number of samples you're going to need over time is basically dependent on the variability, the properties of the connection that you see. And I'll tell you right now, and like now that we have some of that data over time, I'll tell you some of them probably one is enough. You know, it's like pretty stable, and others it's like, boy, I don't know, because it's like doing this. And so we have started to like characterize some of that with more like, I would say, non-temporal metrics. Like one of the things that obviously comes to mind is variance, but another thing that that I came up with that we use in some of our papers is basically normal. We call it normalized reduction. Is you basically take 90th minus 10th and divide by the 90th or whatever, and you basically see like, okay, how much of this action is going on. So we see that like some connections are like super nice and some of them are like this all the time. And so I haven't seen too many papers on that, but I think this is another area that, again, this is like still working on. This is going to keep me busy for the next 5 years probably, is that, because I suspect, I don't know, maybe our MLab friends also have some thoughts on this. I suspect that there is correlation spatially in, I mean, everybody's obsessed with throughput, but it's like, well, reliability, right? Like, I bet there's more of this going on in like certain neighborhoods than others. And I also bet that this correlates with bad, like high latency and other just bad stuff that people haven't really bothered to look at. But yeah. Yeah. That's a good question. In fact, on our latest like NSF project, one of the partners is Cable Labs, because they have some of the data on this. So like this is the next step, which is like I mean, one of the things we started to do with those clusterings is like, well, like let's now see if we can map this onto like infrastructure and see. Yeah. Mm, yeah. 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 Yeah, no, and I think Neil Spring, who formerly at Maryland, I think had done some really nice work like correlating rainstorms, thunderstorms with higher latencies. Yeah, yeah.
So from the paper to the article, does one of the journalists just kind of read your paper and then write an article about it, or do they just question? Or?
I'm trying to remember the chronology of that because I think I have to go back and look, but that was a fairly unique partnership, in fact, because like others have typically it plays out like you write a paper and then the journalists like basically ask you questions about it. That's often how it goes. And this one, the journalists came to us and they're like, we want to do this thing. And we were like, well, I don't know, like let's figure out if we can write a research paper or whatever about it.
The article first, then they asked you to substantiate it, right?
It's sort of like, I mean, we were like, do we even like, is this worth our time? Because is there like a hard problem here? And we're like, yeah, I suppose there could be like a paper like mapping, kind of like how we did the web testing thing. Like, yeah, let's just do the paper mapping the video resolution to the speed. Notice I didn't even show those results. I mean, they're in the paper, but it turned out that the more interesting problem was like, how do you do it? Like, how do you basically do the inference? So in that case, like for me, like the paper, the technical contribution of the paper turned out to be relatively unrelated to the spin on the article. But that one was like an interesting project because we were meeting with the journal reporters almost every week for about 2 years.
So they have this idea.
Yeah, and we owe that one to them as well because we wouldn't have had the deployment without them, right? It's like, how do you convince 60 people in New York City to like let you spy on their home network traffic for like a year? Yeah, it'd be a big one. Or you just work at the journal and you're like, hey guys, you work for me, like you're gonna put this thing in, which is what happened in this case. So.
All right, let's tag Nick again.
Okay, thank you.
Again, there's a student session in the afternoon. Lock